welcome to this seminar of the Standing Group on European Studies, seminar that I co-chair with Jonathan Zeitling from the University of Amsterdam. And today we have the pleasure of having a presentation on the effect of impact assessments on the European Union legislative process by Amie Kreppel and Michael Webb. So I will briefly introduce the speakers. Amie Kreppel is Chairman Chair, Professor of Political Science and Director of the University of Florida Center for European Studies, and she has written extensively on the political institutions of Europe, with a special focus on the European Union institution and Italy. Michael Webb is Research Assistant and PhD student at the University of Florida, and his research focuses on the structural forces explaining the rise of populism, as well as the institutions of the EU. And we have today the pleasure of having Joseph Dunne as a discussant. He's Director of the European Parliament Liaison Office in Washington, DC, and responsible for the relations between the European Parliament and the US Congress. And during his career, he worked in the European Parliament committees, was director in the EPRS, so the European Parliament Research Service, and was Deputy Chief of Staff to the European Parliament President, Pat Cox, between 2002 and 2004. So thank you to the three of you for what looks like a very interesting seminar. Amie and Michael, you have the floor for about 30 to 35 minutes. And then Joseph will give us his insights and reaction. And after that, the audience will be able to ask questions or make suggestions. You can also use the chat or just raise your hand at the end of the discussion with Joseph. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nathalie and Jonathan, for inviting us. I have the rare pleasure as a senior scholar and advisor to be able to hand off the hard work to my colleague, Mike Webb, and he will be doing the presentation. We'll both be available for questions. I would note that he is lead author on this paper. So all of the faults are with me. Most of the intelligent things that are being said are with Mike. So with that, Mike, I'll hand it off to you.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'll share my screen now. Can everybody see that? All right, cool. Okay, so today I'll be presenting our project in progress, referred to as Simpler, Clearer, and Less Transparent, Saliency and Transparency in the EU Legislative Process. So we start with a diagram of the ordinary legislative procedure, which I'm sure most people here are familiar with. But just as a reminder, the Commission introduces a proposal. The proposal is passed to the European Parliament, who can then pass it to the Council with amendments or simply accepting it as it is. If the Council doesn't like it, it can pass it back. And that back and forth creates a paper trail of documents, which are useful for individuals like us who are interested in sort of tracking the legislative process, and also for the general public in the sense that they provide a fair degree of transparency. But there's a problem, and the problem is that over time, maybe it's not a problem, but there's certainly a transition which has taken place, which has led to less transparency. And this chart is taken from a report produced by the European Union, looking at trends in the ordinary legislative procedure from 2014 to 2019, but it actually provides information going back a little bit further than that. And as you can see, while in the 1999 to 2004 parliamentary period, we had legislation ending in all three phases of the ordinary legislative process. Over time, the proportion of legislation which is accepted at some point in first reading has gone up and up and up. And in the 2014 to 2019 period, which is the Juncker term, it was actually 99% of legislation was finished either from a first reading from the European Parliament or a first reading from the Council. And this is great from an efficiency perspective, but isn't great from a transparency perspective for the reason that I just mentioned, which is that the legislative paper trail, which is useful for understanding the process, is not there to the same extent. And so this is something that a lot of other scholars have brought up, that concern with transparency. And the reason for this transition from a process that sort of passes through 3 different phases with lots of different documents being produced to one where a single document is sort of quickly passed through in the first reading are informal meetings called trilogues, which again, I think most people here are probably familiar with, but which are, for those who aren't, informal meetings that are done in private between the Commission, the Council, and the European Parliament, or negotiators from those 3 institutions, and which give them a chance to sort of do the hard work of legislating away from the eyes of the public, and to arrive at sort of an acceptable agreement. And for those who have seen what the legislative process looks like for a document that comes out of one of these trilogues, basically the document gets passed to the Parliament, and the Parliament then passes on its first reading, which is just a single line in parentheses saying, we agree with the document as it is. And then it gets pushed forward to the Council to be accepted there. And that's there's not anything wrong with that per se, as long as the necessary procedures are being put in place elsewhere to ensure that transparency is available. But as other scholars have pointed out, even though institutions like the EP have taken steps to try and make trilogues a little bit more transparent, they aren't really meeting the expectations of those sort of critical experts on the outside. And so what comes from this little discussion, hopefully, is the fact that there is an issue of transparency in the EU, or that at least there is an issue of transparency in the context of the ordinary legislative procedure and regulations, directives, and decisions that are produced through that procedure. And so that brings us to a question of how can we measure this lack of transparency, or how can we measure the extent to which legislative activity, which takes place in trilogues, is not is going on unobserved, and to what extent can we see it taking place in the context of the sort of traditional 3-phase ordinary legislative procedure. And so a lot of scholars have looked at this question, I think, and a lot of them have tended to focus at a small n level. So looking at interviews, looking at individual cases and sort of tracing the documents that pass through there. And I think we differentiate ourselves here by taking a large N approach. And what I mean by that is that we've collected all of the proposals that have been passed through the ordinary legislative procedure, which have resulted in successful outcomes that are available on the EURLEX database. And just to sort of add to that sort of description of the data that we're working with here, we constructed a series of programmatic scrapers which have gone through the EURLEX database, collecting documents, collecting text, and also collecting metadata. So if you were to go to a proposal page on the EURLEX website, it would have a link to the document, and then it would have a whole bunch of information about the procedure or the procedural life of the document, but that information isn't available anywhere in a data set. And so what we've done is write a program to go through, collect that data, and create a bunch of variables for us. So if the procedural history of the document says something like, there was a second reading, there were amendments offered on this date, the rapporteur was this person, we collected all of that and sort of put it into a data set, which we can then use to ask some interesting questions. And the second part, and this is the part that I think makes this particularly novel, is that we have used plagiarism software to look at the extent to which proposals or outcomes differ from the original proposal. And so this software will look at 2 documents and make line-by-line comparisons to see how much of the original content from the proposal is in the outcome and how much of the content in the outcome is actually new. And this software provides us with a number which ranges from 0 to 100, and which we refer to as a difference score. And so the difference score actually gives us a sense of the extent of legislative activity that took place for a given proposal, regardless of whether it passes through the trilogues or passes through the ordinary legislative procedure, where we would have otherwise had, different procedural indicators such as amendments, second reading, third reading, etc. And in that sense, it's sort of useful because regardless of how transparent the process is, we can arrive at a sort of a rough measure of the extent of change that has taken place in the document, which can then be used and compared against other information to tell us something about the process. And so the histogram that I presented on this page here looks at the different scores for directives, regulations, and decisions, and they're colored to sort of help distinguish between the three different populations. And as you can see, decisions generally have a lower difference score, which makes sense because decisions are smaller in scope, tend to be a little bit shorter, and are not necessarily going to be as controversial. But as I just mentioned, the thing that makes the difference score useful is that we can compare it against other elements of data. And one of the things that we use are procedural indicators of conflict. And so, of course, with the ordinary legislative procedure, if the EP is unhappy with the proposal as it stands, it can offer amendments. And that sort of that the EP deciding to offer amendments during the first reading is the sort of initial indicator that the standard process of the ordinary legislative procedure is being triggered, right? And so what we did was to create a dummy variable, which indicates for all of those proposals where amendments are present, we have a 1, and for all the other ones, we have a 0. So we know where the OLP is present. We know exactly how much the proposals are changing. And so now we can ask, is it the case that those proposals that have amendments on them or that are subject to the standard ordinary legislative procedure, do they change more? Has the use of amendments gone down? And as the use of amendments gone down, has the similarity score also gone down? Or have the different scores, has the extent of legislative activity for a given proposal also gone down over time? So we can try and get a sense of sort of to what extent the activity in the legislature or the activity in the legislative process has changed, or if it has changed, which can sometimes be difficult to tell when the process is not transparent. And then in this table, you can also see that there is a pretty distinct drop in the use of amendments from the second Barroso term to the Juncker term. The van der Leyen data that we have, because of when it was drawn, I think there were only 80 proposals in Eurolex at the time, so it's a little bit inclusive, and I wouldn't want to draw too many assumptions from it, but we've included it in here because the multi-level models that we use can sort of take advantage of that information later on. So these two charts give a sense of the average likelihood of an amendment across commissions and the average difference score across commissions holding all other factors equal. So these are the random intercepts for each of these groups. And so you can see with the Barroso first and second term, the likelihood of amendment is roughly 50%, but it drops quite significantly during the Juncker term, which tracks with what we see as the sort of the takeoff of trilogues as and the reduction in the use of the standard OLP. And on the right side, you can see that the difference scores do drop as well, but they don't drop quite as drastically. So there were fewer differences, and I think this probably speaks to what advocates of trilogues talk about, which is the increased efficiency. So there are sort of more refined, the legislation as it emerges is a little bit more refined, and perhaps the language is a little bit simpler. But I think the thing to point out here is that we are able to sort of capture that distinct drop in the both the transparency of the EU and also see that, or the transparency of the legislative process, while also seeing that the difference scores are not dropping quite as dramatically. So a roughly 25% reduction in difference score from the second Barroso term to the Juncker term, and a much more significant drop in the likelihood of an amendment during the same period. But I think the core question that we want to ask, having sort of constructed these two variables, which can then be used to try and get at levels of transparency in the EU, is, okay, we can, or at least in the context of the ordinary legislative process, we have this measure, and now we can ask, we know generally that there are concerns about transparency in the EU, but is it the case that when proposals are particularly important, that transparency returns to the process, that those are more likely to pass through the ordinary legislative procedure? Or is it the case that, in fact, they are less likely, that the need for efficiency makes it more likely that issues will be resolved in trilogues and not taken to the sort of more public forum of the standard ordinary legislative procedure? And so to ask that question, we also have to ask, we can measure salience. And there are a number of different ways to do this. You could look at the degree of engagement in the media. You could engage with expert interviews. You could look for procedural measures of conflict. But as I just mentioned, it's sort of hard to do that when the process itself tends to be sort of cut short at the first reading point. And so instead, what we've opted for is to use the presence of impact assessments. And for those who are unfamiliar with impact assessments, they are ex-ante legislative evaluations, which is to say there's something that's produced beforehand to try and ensure that the best decisions are being made when it comes to the construction of legislation. But for our purposes, the really important point to be made here is that critics of the Commission and those who sort of advocate for clearer and more responsible legislation have argued that impact assessments should always be present with every piece of legislation. And the Commission came back and said, well, that's nice, but they're kind of expensive to put together. They require resources. And for that reason, we would like to say that we will only produce an impact assessment if an issue is particularly important. If we believe that a piece of legislation is going to have a significant environmental, cultural, or economic impact, then we will produce an impact assessment. And that's useful for us because it means that every time we see a proposal with an impact assessment, we can effectively say that the Commission has said that that proposal is important, that it's significant. And so you have, in effect, a sort of marker of salience, a marker of significance. And so to return to our original question, which is to what extent does the transparency, to what extent is the transparency of the European legislative process affected by salience, we can ask, to what extent do we see any significant variation in levels of difference scores and in the likelihood of an amendment when an impact assessment is present with a proposal? And so we assume that because these are more important issues, they're more likely to be interested actors, there's more likely to be contestation, or we assumed rather, that we should expect to see higher levels of difference scores. So there's going to be more legislative activity on a given proposal, and also a greater likelihood for amendments, because it seems possible that issues might not be worked out in the trilogue meetings, and it might need to be taken to the ordinary legislative procedure, or the formal mechanisms of the ordinary legislative procedure. And so just a little bit more information on issue assessments or impact assessments for those who aren't familiar, and to give a little bit of a sense of the scope and scale of impact assessments. They're meant to cover the existence of whatever the existence and consequences of whatever the particular problem is that the legislation is supposed to be addressing. I think it's 3 potential solutions they're supposed to offer, although critics of impact assessments have said that the Commission tends to just use them as an opportunity to frame their preferred issues. or their preferred solution, and also to address the cost of non-action. And as I mentioned, the Commission is obligated to produce impact assessments for any issue mentioned in its work program, as well as any issue that it believes is going to have a significant social, economic, or environmental impact. And so from 2005, when the use of impact assessments begins in earnest, or at least the record of the use of impact assessments begins in earnest on Eurlex, 797 impact assessments have been produced, and over the same period, 1,746 proposals have been initiated and sort of passed through the ordinary legislative procedure. And so it's roughly half of documents are identified by the Commission as being especially important, or especially likely to have a significant impact. And so here are a list of the variables that we include. Of course, we have the dichotomous EP amendments, the continuous similarity or difference score. We're working on, the name is a work, work in progress. And then our independent variable of interest is the presence of an impact assessment, which is a dichotomous variable. And then we also account for the type of legislation. So as I mentioned, decisions tend to be smaller in scope, as well as a number of other procedural measures. So the number of mandatory consultees, the number of consultees for information, the number of related documents that are produced, as well as random intercepts for year and subject. So these aren't hierarchical random intercepts, they're just sort of standalone levels that are being accommodated. And in that sense, it's sort of an easier way to interpret fixed effects. So instead of having to have a point of reference, you can just sort of look at them generally at their relative strength. So I'm gonna skip this slide, sorry. So the, I've just realized I'm presenting with the version of the slides from just before I finished my final edits, so I apologize. But the 0 point should have a red line there to make it a little bit easier to understand, but I'll just add some extra explanation. On the right side, we have the effects of impact assessments, or the presence of an impact assessment on the difference score. And all of these figures are significantly different from 0, and they're all positive. So the presence of an impact assessment is associated with roughly a 5-point increase in the difference score for a given proposal, or from a given outcome relative to its proposal. So we can see that when there's an impact assessment present, you are more likely to have legislative activity. And for the first and second Barroso terms, when an impact assessment was present, you were also considerably more likely to see amendments. And with the Juncker term, the term is reversed. So it's still a strong effect, but now it's negative. And it's saying that when an impact assessment is present, you're significantly less likely to see amendments. And so there's been a shift away from the ordinary legislative procedure and towards trilogues for important legislation, and that started in the Juncker Commission. And so these rather large and confusing charts were supposed to have a title, but as I just mentioned, I'm using the wrong version of the slides. And so it should say random effects for the directorates, directorates and sub-offices, looking at the likelihood of amendments on the left side and the difference score on the right side. And so highlighted in red what I think are the sort of standout sub-offices to note. And so you can see that for the most part, the likelihood of an amendment and the level of the difference score is not very different for most of the sub-offices and directorates in the Commission, but there are a couple which stand out. So you can see that legal services, employment, social affairs, and inclusion, and budget have all see significantly lower, a significantly lower likelihood of amendments, as well as significantly lower difference scores. And this is especially true for legal services, which was the leading service for, I think, 75 or so proposals over the period that we covered. And they have a 20-point reduction in difference score on average. And that's pretty significant when you think that the average difference score is roughly 25 in these analyses. So it's almost an 80% reduction. It's really large. And so I think this actually speaks to a different kind of lack of transparency, or potentially could speak to a different kind of lack of transparency. I think there are really two potential ways to interpret this. Either these are pieces of legislation where everyone just kind of agrees on what's going on, so there's no conflict. It passes through. There's no legislative activity. There are no amendments because there's nothing going on. Or it could be the case that whatever issues there were around this legislation were worked out ahead of time before the proposal was even brought to the table, and because of this, there's no legislative activity. And that speaks to a different kind of lack of transparency from the one that we originally set out to measure here, which was to try and understand the degree of legislative activity which takes place in the trilogues. And so that's, I think, pretty interesting, but something that we really haven't addressed, and which is probably sort of an avenue for further research. And then we did the same thing, but using subject area. So every proposal that was loaded into the EuroLex database was provided with the Eurovoc subject code. And Eurovoc is a coding system that the European Union uses to help organize its documents by subject. And so we've included that here as well as another set of random intercepts. And just as with the last slide, on the left side, you have the likelihood of amendments, and on the right side, you have changes in the similarity score. And so you can see that there are a couple of spaces that stand out as being a little bit distinct, but not to the same extent as with the directorate. So we actually see considerably more variation in similarity score and the likelihood of amendments across directorates as compared to the sort of general subject of the legislation. So you can see that employing and working conditions have the same sort of pattern of the lower similarity score and lower likelihood of amendments, while those subjects which deal with justice, so this is sort of the rights of individuals in the context of the European Union for the most part, or what the subcategories have to do with, tend to be more contested. So they're both more likely to have amendments and more likely to see legislative activity in terms of changes to the different scores. Okay, so to conclude, our goal with this paper was to try and get a sense of the degree to which the lack of transparency to try and get a sense of how the legislative process has changed with the introduction of trilogues. And what we can see is that while the transparency, which was a benefit of the ordinary legislative procedure, has been sort of significantly reduced, the rate of legislative activity insofar as documents continue to change as they pass from proposals to outcomes remains more or less static. And we're also able to look at the effective impact assessments as markers of salience. And we can highlight that in those contexts where we would probably hope that the EU will be most transparent because the proposal has been identified as important, we actually see a reduction in transparency in the sense that we see higher levels of legislative activity. Proposals are changing more dramatically as they pass through the legislative process, but we're actually seeing less of how they're changing in the sense that more of it is being done in trilogues. And I think that the findings that we showed for the subject and directorate random effects also sort of highlight that the rate at which or the character of the sort of shifting transparency of the EU is not static across subjects, and is not static across the different sub-offices of the Commission. There are different spaces where it's more present. So that's also something that I think could potentially be considered in future research. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. So now I give the floor to Joseph Dunne.
Thank you very much, Natalie, and thank you, Mike, and also Professor Kreppel for this extremely interesting analysis. I think it certainly points to there being a very rich vein for further research here. And of course, my problem in reacting to what was said is that just so many thoughts and so many things came to mind that it's difficult to know how to string it all together, but I'll try and do my best in a couple of minutes. I should perhaps say where I'm coming from, because it's perhaps a little bit strange that the director of the European Parliament Office in Washington should be speaking, but I spent 7 years as what they call here a staff director, as a head of secretariat for the Internal Market Committee, at the more or less coinciding with the time when impact assessment was becoming an important part of committee procedure. And then later on, I was involved in the creation of the European Parliament Research Service, which again partly modelled on the Congress, where we were busy trying to develop a scrutiny toolkit and trying to support the European Parliament's efforts in terms of impact assessment, because I think it's worth remembering that impact assessment as such is a US import. It was very much influenced by the OECD and the United States in the early 2000s, and they took as the kind of benchmark or the sort of best practice the famous EO 12866 of 1993, which interestingly also uses the word significant rule. So it also says that impact assessment should be done when the rule or the regulation is going to have significant impact. So, but of course, in the US system, the impact assessment happens downstream. It happens after the Congress has adopted the law and the federal agencies are about to implement, and they use this much admired notice and comment system. And so the idea was that the European Union should do something similar, but of course importing it in at the executive stage in the European system meant that you were basically doing it at the beginning, towards the beginning of the process, and not towards the end of the process. And I think it's always been the case that the impact assessment was never binding on the Commission, or they have always made it asserted that they're not bound by the impact assessment. So it was just a factor that the College of Commissioners would take into consideration when they were adopting. And so there was always quite a big difference between the proposal on the table and the end result. And nothing, of course, impact assessment didn't happen during the process. And the European Parliament, I think, was concerned to try and fix that problem in a way by trying to build in impact assessment into its own processes. So that's why you had the interinstitutional agreement of 2003, which I think was very significant and also was rewritten and adapted in 2016. And I think these are actually significant elements in the way the institutions work together. But the idea of the interinstitutional agreement was that the Parliament and also the Council of Ministers would impact assess their own kind of modifications to the Commission proposal, so that the final result wouldn't be so far removed from the initial impact assessment as is currently the case. So I don't know if I could pick up some of your sort of basic points. When I was doing my 7 years of trilogues, I always had in the back of my mind exactly the problem that you pose. The difference between, what did you call the differential scores between the original proposal and the final proposal. My kind of feeling, because we were, I think, always too busy really to properly analyze the results. As soon as you were finished one procedure, you were immediately catapulted into the next. So there was rarely enough time to really analyze what happened. But I had this instinctive feeling, at least during the early, from let's say 2004 to 2012, that in the discussions and amendments that the Council had the upper hand sort of 60% of the time, and the Parliament would sort of win 40% of the time. But it's difficult to argue with the proposition that there's a lack of transparency in because of the system of trilogues. But again, here I would say that draw a comparison with the Congress, because it's interesting. You see in the US system, you see I think a very parallel development where the paper process is not what's actually happening. The US equivalent of the conciliation or the third reading is, of course, the conference committee, and I believe that in the next couple of weeks we'll have a conference committee on a piece of legislation. But that'll be the first time in more than a decade that the conference committee has met. So I think you see also in the US a tendency towards I don't know, more deal making, and I don't know if it's because the EP in the European case is because the EP is a co-equal partner, and you cannot really negotiate in public. So you said at the beginning there was this very interesting. So you had to counterbalance what you said. You said efficiency and transparency. I would have seen it more in terms of efficiency and legitimacy, and sort of transparency as a kind of element of it being legitimate. But then you can also think in terms of throughput legitimacy, and so the actual efficiency of the output is also a legitimizing feature. So you could say that what's happening is that the Council has co-opted the European Parliament into its way of working, so its sort of member state intergovernmental way of working. But at the same time, I think it's undeniable that the European Parliament has had a huge impact. So that, and it certainly gets its amendments through, or its views through, almost half of the time. So I don't know. I think it's worth examining, and perhaps another more political reflection on your point. Your very interesting measures of procedural conflict. I mean, I think you had that in Barroso there were amendments on 71% of the proposals, and then Juncker and von der Leyen it drops to 30% or 40%. But the difference between Barroso and Juncker, as far as the Parliament was concerned, was that Juncker was Parliament's man. So he was the Spitzenkandidat. So there was basically Juncker was publicly, or in some sense, he was implementing an agreed political program. So, unlike the previous Commission, and I think in von der Leyen's case, you have to take into account the effect of COVID and the fact that the remote working of Parliament impeded the amendment process to some extent. I think that's something that Natalie has recently been writing about. So maybe to sum up, because I could go on, I could go down various rabbit holes here. I think that your basic proposition is probably correct. I mean, the question that because the Commission says it's a significant proposal, therefore does an impact assessment. I mean, I don't know if that's always holds, or if that's a real corollary. You see it in, for example, that where a proposal is really sensitive, especially in the justice and home affairs area, the European Commission doesn't produce an impact assessment, but it's in a way because the issue is too explosive. So I think in a case like that, having or not having an impact assessment is, or maybe the fact of not having an impact assessment is indeed a measure. It could be a measure of salience in itself, in a kind of paradoxical way. You have to think that the Commission doesn't always keep to its own rules, even by its own admission. In one of the recent reports of the Regulatory Scrutiny Board, they say that they complied about 90% of the time. I think a report in the Parliament thinks that they complied 2/3 of the time. But that's more recently, at least according to the Parliament, the more recent impact assessments have been sort of more consistent with what the Commission has promised. I think there's a question of the quality of impact assessment. You yourself touched, I think, at the end on the question of, are issues worked out ahead of time? A chair of the Internal Market Committee used to talk about the Commission, because our better regulation was supposed to be evidence-based policy making, and she said sometimes you would have, coming from the Commission, you would have policy-based evidence making. In other words, sort of post hoc rationalization of what the Commission wanted to do anyway, and then they would sort of commission a report to prove that this is what was needed to be done. However, I think this is much less the case. That may have been the case a decade ago, I think, and also the work of the Regulatory Scrutiny Board has been admirable. I think the quality has increased. So, you know, the question, to what extent does the content of the impact assessment matter? I think the Parliament is trying to make it important. Perhaps the issue is that impact assessment could be, in certain cases, a box-ticking exercise, and certainly what the European Parliament is trying to do was to make it an integral part of the procedure. You know, the Parliament has been calling for a long time for a law, a European law on administrative procedure, which in a sense would oblige the Commission in every case to do this, to do an impact assessment. And of course the Commission doesn't want to do that, but what the Parliament, at least towards the end of my time in the Internal Market Committee, we tried to make it part of the procedure by always having as the first discussion of a new proposal a presentation of the impact assessment, where the Commission would have to explain the strategic choices underlying a particular proposal, so that you know, we couldn't take that the fact of the proposal couldn't be taken for granted. And sometimes the Parliament would try to influence the content of the Commission proposal by producing a strategic report or an own initiative report saying what the Parliament thought should be in a proposal. And this is my last point, that to some extent I think it's always been the case that the Commission has factored in its proposals always the reaction of Member States, and maybe laterally in the last 10 years it's also begun to factor in the reaction of the European Parliament. So all of this kind of interacts in a very complex way with impact assessment and what the real significance of the impact assessment is. But I don't know if any of that made sense. Mike, I thought your research is really interesting and really useful, and certainly I think have also pointed to many possible new avenues for digging deeper. I think it's I've always felt myself that impact assessment is terribly important. It'll be interesting. The whole better regulation agenda is terribly important. It was often driven in the Parliament by UK members. Interesting to see that post-Brexit we now have a new report going through Parliament through our Committee on Legal Affairs by Timo Vulcan. And it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. But I noticed that one of the, at least for the rapporteur's wishes, is that impact assessment be performed on all acts without exception. Okay. Thank you very much, Natalie. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you very much. I don't know whether Amy and Mike will want to react a little bit before we open up the floor.
Yeah, I'll just thank you. I'll just say a few words, and then Mike, if you want to go ahead. I mean, one of the things I want to say is that, again, as I mentioned before it officially started, our interest in impact assessments came somewhat from a utilitarian search for a good measure of salience, and then it opened up a Pandora's box. So I want to be clear that we don't look at the content of the impact assessment. We look at the impact assessment as an indicator of significance. And in the end, maybe not salience or contestation, but significance. And what that led us to was the goal of trying to understand, given the downward slope of transparency, an ability to see if at least, perhaps, when things were more important, there was more transparency. And what we find is, again, that there isn't more transparency, but there do appear to be substantive changes being made, or at least lots of changes being made. We don't look at the content yet of those changes, right? That's another pass down the road, is actually to try to analyze the text differences. So not just the amount of difference, but the substantive content of the differences, because it is possible, I suppose, that there are very high dissimilarity scores because a lot of thes were changed to A's or something. That it doesn't look like that when we do a preliminary look at it, but we haven't done content analysis of these changes. So I want to make sure the contours of what we do and what we don't do is clear, also because there is so much more that could be and hopefully will be done. In terms of the comparison to the US, I appreciate learning that the impact assessment was yet another thing borrowed from the US Congress. But I do think it's a little different to say that the conference committee has sort of fallen off in use over the last decade, and that is similar to trilogues and lack of transparency in the EP, to the extent that conference committee is last stage, and it is an opportunity for the two chambers to get together and reconcile at the end. So if what we were having was trilogues in the third reading, that would be one thing. But the truth is, the third reading was always not very transparent. It was always in camera. What we're having now is a lack of amendments and a lack of ability to see what's happening in trilogues. And this was such a problem that the EP itself tried to tie the hands of its own rapporteurs in trilogues, right, by giving them their marching orders, because they felt that they themselves didn't have control over what kinds of agreements were being reached and how those agreements were being done. And there's significant literature on why that might not have been a good choice. So what we're still left with is that balance between efficiency and transparency. And I thought it was very interesting, Joe, the idea that the council has co-opted the EP into its mode of working. I think that's a really fabulous insight. You know, as someone who studied the EP for so long and seen the EP have this just deep desire to be taken seriously, to be able to have an impact, to play with the big kids, to join the ranks of the important EU institutions, which certainly in the 70s and 80s it was not considered to be part of, that they might, in order to engage more with the council, in order to be seen as a partner with the council, in order to really negotiate with the council in a bicameral, sort of largely symmetrical system, they might be willing to adapt the working methods of the council, which have historically always been intransparent, right? Co-repair is almost impenetrable. And I think thinking about this transition in the EP from this perspective is actually very helpful for me. That's a very helpful way for me to understand why this is happening, right? Efficiency alone is not really a sufficient enough explanation for me, but I think understanding the need to get along and go along with the council helps me more. So Mike, I didn't know if you had anything you wanted to add.
Yeah, well, I wanted to thank Joseph for the really interesting comments, and then just to also comment on I think the point is well taken that the impact assessments, you know, are maybe not always used in the same way, especially across subjects. And so that's definitely something we could look at. I mean, we could try and get a sense. We could allow that effect to vary across the different directorates, across the different subjects, and see whether or not it does change drastically in that context. That could potentially be really interesting, but also sort of understanding that I don't know if anyone has thoughts on different procedural measures or just kind of like things that are traceable that might be indicators of salience in a particular context that we could gather up and which we could use side by side with the impact assessments, that could potentially be really interesting, because that would give us a chance to see, you know, how often does the impact assessment get used when it's significant? Because I think that's another, if that's the case, that's another great question to be asked, right? Yeah. Oh, and there's the other thing, at least for the similarity scores that we're using here, the thes and the as are accounted for. So we're good in that respect.
I knew that. I was just giving an example.
Yeah, that's it for me. Thank you again, everyone.
Okay, thank you. So now don't hesitate to raise your hand if you have a question. I already see that Christian Rowe has his hand raised. So Christian, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for this super interesting work, as always. I would be super happy to read it at some point, actually. I'm very curious. But I also want to make two more critical comments, maybe, as it's work in progress, hopefully useful. And my first one is not only technical, but I would just first like to clarify whether your models on the proposal level or on the law level control for the stage of the procedure that the proposal has actually reached, because only then I would buy into the fact of whether you isolate the effect of impact assessments, right? Because in this first figure that we have seen, we see that under Juncker, basically we end up in the first reading only. So I would make sure to disentangle that effect. And then second, on the impact assessments, when I saw the title of your seminar, actually I had completely different expectations than treating this as an indicator for salience, actually. And it might, I see Miriam nodding down here on my screen. I mean, we formulated in former times a very different expectation, because we argued impact assessments are a very effective tool for internal coordination within the Commission, because different Commission directorates come into play through this tool. And so different interests are already covered, right? So our expectation at that time was that it would actually decrease legislative conflict in interinstitutional decision-making, right? And also, if you think about this in political economy terms, if you think about legislators as boundedly rational, right? They get a thick proposal from the Commission and they need to figure out what the issue is, basically. If it comes with an impact assessment, they get all information about trade-offs, possible conflicts, costs, and so on. So I think that would make it much easier for them actually to engage in amending the proposal. So I'm not sure whether salience really is the driving force here. I'm really not sure about this. And also, that's a little bit of a conspiracy theory, but I usually treat the Commission as rather rational. And if it would know that impact assessments signal salience to the legislators, the choice of having an impact assessment is endogenous to your phenomenon, right? It might choose, if it has a proposal where it doesn't want to have too much conflict, then probably try to avoid the impact assessment there, right? That's also why Joseph Dunne said the EP calls for impact assessment each and everywhere, right? But thanks anyway, that's super interesting. I look forward to the paper.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands for the moment, so maybe Mike or Amie, you want to react already to this?
Thank you, Christian, for the comments. Yeah, controlling for the stage of procedure. I guess the idea of the Commission using the impact assessment strategically is certainly possible. Although I would think that they are somewhat constrained. Anything that's in the work program has to be there. And I have argued repeatedly that if it's in the work program, it's something that they care about. And so I would be interested in something that I actually haven't thought of until the second, Mike, is we should actually probably control for which IA instances are work program and which are not, right? And we have that data, so we can certainly do that and see if there's a difference in the impact of the impact assessments when they are sort of required, but also work program related, and when they are other, to try to untangle that. And I get that, I mean, if it would be easier to amend if there were an impact assessment, then we would expect to see more amendments when there are impact assessments, and that's not what we see. So if that were happening, we're not seeing the result that you might anticipate. Mike, did you want to chime in?
Yes, if I can reach the unmute button. So I think I certainly can see the argument you're making around how the impact assessment is an opportunity for concerned actors to sort of hash out their differences ahead of time, so that then they're handled going into the process, which reduces the likelihood of amendment. Yeah, that makes perfect sense, and I think we sort of see that right in the evaluation that comes out. But that is still, I think that speaks to, if we're treating the impact assessments as markers of salience, and I think that this sort of gets at your second point, which I think has to be addressed to be able to go back to the first point. It could be the case that the Commission is saying, like, we don't want attention on this, so we're not going to produce an impact assessment. but that kind of implies that the European Parliament and other interested actors aren't able to sort of read the proposals for themselves and sort of determine whether or not it's something that is significant and that they care about. And so I guess it depends on how much credit you're giving them as independent actors. And so I think probably it's something to sort of play around with and test, maybe to try and investigate a little bit further. But assuming that it is a marker of salience, it doesn't really matter from our perspective what effect the impact assessment itself is having, insofar as it just allows us to identify those proposals that are salient, right? Outside of that, we're not really interested in the causal impact it's having. It's just a way for us to flag those proposals that have been marked as significant. And then once we have that, we can just kind of do, like a difference of means across the two populations. And that's interesting in and of itself, because it highlights the way the process is different for those two different groups. But I mean, I think the points are all really well taken, and I definitely want to look at the work program stuff as well. So yeah, thank you very much.
Natalie, do you allow one very small addition?
Sure.
I think this is an important debate, but what I missed to say is that neither of our explanations, be it yours or the one that I just offered, really explain the switch between Juncker and the other periods, right? I just wanted to flag, that's really the interesting part, right? Just not to miss that.
And just as an aside, Christian, you see that change in every analysis you do, right? When I look at annual work programs, I see the same change line. When every change, and so is it Lisbon? Is it the Euro crisis? Is it enlargement and a delayed effect? I mean, there's so many overlapping possibilities for great schisms and great changes that it's over identified in a sense. And I've hit this problem again and again. And so I just sort of, you put the footnote disclaimer that, oh, by the way, this is also exactly when this happened and exactly when that happened. And who knows? I mean, I think I'm increasingly thinking that even though Lisbon largely implemented things that were already de facto, if not de jure, somehow there was a psychological shift, at least in the relationships between the three core institutions. And again, even though it's not, you could say that people started doing it in 2007, even before it was implemented, but there's a psychological something that happened in the way that these institutions are engaging that I think goes beyond the final date at which the formal rules were implemented, given that they had effectively been implemented before. And for me, the fact that we keep coming up with this cut suggests to me that that's the change. And we really won't know until the end of the von der Leyen period, right? We won't know if it was Spitzenkandidaten, which I don't think so, but we won't know until we have the end of von der Leyen, right? Who's not Spitzenkandidaten. And then we'll be able to see if there are some longer term effects or if Juncker is an outlier, and we'll have a little bit more information. Uh-oh, Jonathan's going to yell at me about Spitzenkandidaten.
Jonathan?
Yeah, no, I'm not going to yell at you about Spitzenkandidaten. I have two points. One which follows on from this discussion with Christian, which is that I think that the Juncker Commission on many issues had a very different, wanted to make changes in the way the Commission interacted with the member states, with Parliament, with the legal services. And so I think it's much less to do with the Lisbon Treaty and much more to do with the strategy of the Juncker Commission. And I don't know if you've read the new paper that a lot of people are discussing by Kellerman and Pavone about infringement proceedings. And there you can see, the shifts from the Barroso Commission to the Juncker Commission, and some questions about whether von der Leyen is going to continue with the highly strategic and politicized approach of the Juncker Commission. So I would think that that's much more what's going on. And as you say, we don't really know whether von der Leyen will continue. It looks like to some extent, but also some normalization. The other thing that I would say, and I come from absolutely the opposite methodological approach. So, I tend to look at impact assessments when they come up in particular areas that I'm interested in, and I'm interested also in the debate about better regulation. And so there are questions about, to what is impact assessment responding to pressures from member states, and also the extent to which the Commission may use the impact assessments for strategic framing. I think I would also agree with Christian and Miriam that there's internal coordination in the among the DGs of the Commission going on around and through the impact assessments, and not only them but also fitness checks, which are part of the same process. And there's a question of what is the role of the regulatory scrutiny board, which has been rejecting impact assessments. So a way to look at some of this would be to start from the other end, to look at pieces of legislation which turn out to be very controversial, and then to look at what role does the impact assessment play in that. To what extent do people refer to it? Does it become a football? Do people who want to amend pieces of legislation point to things, arguments in the impact assessment? And that kind of approach, I think, would be complementary to your large and big pattern approach. And I mean, for me, it would make it also more interesting, also because we would have a more granular idea of what's really going on.
Sorry, I was busy taking notes. Yeah, all I can say is thank you, and sorry for misjudging you on the Spitzenkandidaten. I have such a deep and abiding distaste for it that I just assume everyone else likes it more than me. I don't actually have any other comments other than to say thank you for the opportunity and for the insights. I don't know if Mike does. I don't know if we're supposed to end right at noon on the dot since we are over time.
I have one comment. I can be really quick.
Go ahead.
To Jonathan's point. Yeah, I think that's something that I've been interested in as well, trying to understand the extent to which the documents which came out of the Better Regulation Initiative are being used as sort of political tools further down the road. Because you have, I think, in a lot of the agreements, a lot of the legal documents now, outside of impact assessments, which are the ex ante evaluations, you also have the ex post evaluations and agreements for further ex post evaluations. That's something that I've been looking at. I sort of haven't really gone anywhere with it yet, but the idea that you could look at instances where the EP or another interested actor brings up those evaluations, which are done later, as an opportunity to revisit whatever the particular issue was, assuming that the ex post evaluations go in place because the particular piece of legislation is viewed as important or as something that needs to be monitored to ensure that it was effective. And to your point as well, I think that's something we definitely be interested in doing. And if you have any ideas for measures that we could use to identify those pieces of legislation which are particularly conflict heavy post passing, I would definitely be interested in hearing those because that's, potentially if we could pick that up, we could analyze the text of those and look at the impact assessments to try and get at that.
Well, what you certainly do is to, I'm not sure whether this works quantitatively, but when you read discussions of landmark pieces of legislation which have been highly controversial, for example, the GDPR, people often say these were extremely heavily amended, or the number of amendments which was submitted was high. So you could look at pieces of legislation where there were high numbers of amendments and see to what extent the debates about them also raise issues linking back to the impact assessment.
Mm-hmm.
Joseph?
Yes, thank you. Now, I have to come in this discussion on impact assessment as a political football. So I certainly agree. You could even describe sometimes as a procedural device, because if you're a member and you've lost the vote in committee, you can try and stop the procedure by saying, well, there isn't an impact assessment, so we kind of go forward unless we have an impact assessment, and that actually does happen. The kind of examples that Jonathan was talking about, these are old examples, but the REACH proposal certainly would qualify. And in that case, I actually cannot remember now if there was a commission impact assessment, but certainly impact assessments were done and volunteered to the commission. And I remember we counted at one stage that 60 impact assessments had been done on the impact of the REACH regulations. So, and it also has remained controversial in its implementation. And I'm glad also that Mike mentioned ex post, because the kind of design problem I was talking about at the beginning, which kind of leads the EP to try and build in impact assessment into its own processes and to insist on the council doing the same. It also means that ex post assessment is very important and should be, we think, given more importance in the EU system. A last point, perhaps a smaller point, but in terms of your sort of data collection, it might be interesting for you to look at the appraisals that are done, because the European Parliament Research Service tries to help the committees. So because we know that generally people don't read 1,000-page or 600-page impact assessments, so the research service tends to analyze these and produce a shorter version of maximum of 8 pages, but we try and keep it much less, basically highlighting how good the impact assessment is in its own terms, i.e. has the Commission actually done what it said it was going to do, and sometimes can give qualitative indicators. So this is intended to feed into the debate in the committee, which, as I said earlier, ideally the first consideration of a proposal should look at the impact assessment. And maybe just a very last point is impact assessment is itself considered as not a neutral instrument. It tends to be considered as suspicious by the left side of the political spectrum, for the reason that it's much easier to quantify costs than it is to quantify benefits. So you can get very precise figures on what a leisure proposal will cost, but it can often be very difficult to assess the benefits that will bring. So it's considered to be, let's say, a more friendly tool to the right side of the political, or more conservative, small c, side of the political spectrum. So that's, it's a tremendously, the whole discussion today is tremendously, I know you're trying to focus on one aspect, but the whole complex is probably reflects the whole complexity of the legislative process, and impact assessment is a core and I think often overlooked aspect of regulatory policy.
We had noticed in the EP reports there was a general dissatisfaction with the quality of the impact assessments. That seems to be growing a bit more intense over time. I think they didn't quite use, the example of Kissinger and his clever plan, right? You can have World War III, you can do nothing, and then there's my clever plan. But there is the idea that often impact assessments are structured in this way, as Mike noted, to present the Commission's ideal position on a silver platter while everything else looks pretty poor.
Yeah, well, yeah, although I think it has evolved over the years, and I think the Parliament has been giving the Commission and the Regulatory Scrutiny Board better marks in more recent years.
So I just have a quick question. You mentioned a piece of legislation that had 60 impact assessments put together for it.
It's
Is there
REACH.
like a
It's the REACH chemical initiative. I can tell you what it is.
Okay. I guess I just wanted to ask, do you know if there's are those kept anywhere? Is there like a repository where all impact assessments for a given document are?
Yeah,
sorry, that might not be a fair question. I apologize.
No, it's certainly a very valid question. I hope that procedure predated the research service, but yes, I'm sure we have it somewhere in the archives. I'm sure it's possible. But it was a feature of that particular moment after 2004 that we had proposals which brought huge numbers of amendments. We also had the Services Directive at the same time, for which I think there was an impact assessment, but whatever it was considered to be very inadequate at the time. And I think there were, I can't remember offhand, 5,900 amendments for the Services Directive proposal, with just gigantic numbers. And that was probably happening at the same time as there was this move towards the early second reading agreements and move away from the traditional conciliation, kind of first reading, second reading conciliation procedures. And I think going with that was a steadily increased influence of the EP in the process. So maybe the irony of what Amie was talking about in terms of I did think myself that to some extent it felt like the Council was co-opting us, or the European Parliament, into its way of working. But I think the Parliament saw that as a necessary price to pay for having real impact on the legislation. So, and it may not be the case now. I was talking about the period between sort of building up to Lisbon and just after Lisbon. I think it may be a more equal situation now, but on the question of transparency, that's a difficult one, and I do think the reporting has got better. That the rapporteurs, lead negotiators, are feeding back better into committees, but there you have, I think, vast areas for research. There's so much digging to be done there.
As I don't see any other question, I would like to thank Amie, Mike, and Joseph for the very interesting discussion, as well as the audience, of course. And I take this opportunity to also invite you to the next, and I think last seminar of the series for this year with Maya Davis-Cross on the 21st of April. I wish you a very pleasant afternoon.
Thank you to everyone, especially Joseph and SGEU for hosting.
Thanks to all of you for having me. Thank you.